Hi, what we've got today is this. This is the Owon VDS3104 USB scope. It's fairly unusual in having 4 channels. They do a range of these. They do sort of 2 and 4 channel and 25, 50, 60 and 100 megahertz versions, and these seem to sort of break into two classes depending on how much memory it's got. There's the low end which has only got 5K and the high end which has got 10 megasamples. That depends on the number of channels. It's basically 10 megasamples for 2 channels or 5 for 4 channels. So that's clearly sort of the same memory architecture on those. But it falls into these 2 categories. On the low end one, they do a version that's got isolated USB. There is also an option for a LAN connection. So for the high speed ones, you should be able to get isolation because the 10BASE-T LAN connector has built-in isolation. It should be possible to get an isolated scope by using that. Whether you need isolation really depends on what sort of applications you're dealing with. I think even the LAN ones, the channels won't be isolated from each other. And unless you're doing fairly specialist stuff, that can actually be more of a pain than a benefit, because it means you actually have to connect all your probe grounds rather than just relying on the ground. For example, if you're probing around something that's connected to, say, that same computer's USB port, then a lot of the time you can just rely on the USB ground to certainly low frequency applications, just to avoid having to clip all the ground clips on. Comes with 4 of these. These are pretty much the standard probe you get with most Chinese scopes, which are sort of perfectly reasonable. And if you take a look at the connectors on the front, you've got the 4 channels. It's got these plastic, I don't like plastic BNC connectors. They're a little bit can be a bit fragile, not the end of the world, but they're potentially prone to getting bashed. The case has got these sort of soft bumper feet things, which, to be honest, I think are a little bit pointless. Firstly, they don't really stick on very well. They're quite prone to just falling off, and they don't really add. They give you a little bit of a sort of foot grip, but they don't really protect the BNC. So, to be honest, I think you best I'll just throw these away and put some little low profile stick on rubber feet on there. It will do just as good a job and just reduce the bulk a little bit. On the back end, so on the back we've got the probe calibration. We've got this connector. This can be configured to be trigger in, trigger out, or pass fail for the mask test. Now it's one of these little connectors. I'm not actually sure strictly which flavour of small coax this is. It might be SMB or something, but I found a couple in my bag of random coax connectors, so it's not something that's too obscure, but you're not often going to use that, so it's not a big deal. There's an unpopulated COM port, unpopulated LAN port on this one, and the other thing you notice is they've used the wrong USB connector. Now I'm assuming this is just because of the height. Now there's sort of some argument, okay, well that's probably a bit more rugged than a micro USB, but yeah, micro USB is so common now. I think maybe if they perhaps used a micro USB and perhaps recessed it to give it a bit of strain relief, that might have been a better choice than using this, because this basically means you've got to use a non-standard cable rather than just having whatever cable you happen to have on hand. This is the cable that comes with it. Obviously it's the the incorrect A to A thing, but also it's got this dual plug, because the power draw on this is a little bit more than what you can legally take out of a single USB port. I've measured it about 860 milliamps. That seems to be fairly constant regarding what you're doing. Now, my laptop seems to be quite happy providing that out of a single port, but because the whole point about this is it's a sort of a lightweight portable sort of scope for use on the go. USB scopes aren't really any substitute for proper benchtop scopes, where you really want knobs, but when you want to take something that's sort of fairly small and light, then you're probably going to be using it with a laptop, so it's not ideal if it has to use 2 ports, but I'm sure you could, if you need to, you could probably make up some sort of power splitter arrangement to run it off an external adapter if you really wanted to. It's just a bit annoying, but if it takes that amount of current, then there's probably not a huge amount you can do with it. I'd imagine perhaps the lower round ones might perhaps take low enough power to run directly from a single port, but on my laptop at least, it does seem to work okay on a single port. Nothing seems to complain. And there's also a LED there. Sure, I've just done a quick test. What it appears to be, this looks like it turns green once the internal processor is booted, so if we just plug it in, wait for a few seconds. I did hear a relay click last time. I wonder if maybe they're using latching relays and that would already latch, but say it then goes green. But if I reduce the power supply voltage, instantly it is a switching regulator. As I'm reducing the supply voltage, the current is increasing. At 5 volts it's about 770 milliamps, but it's not active, it's not got anything talking to it, so that might go up a little bit when it's actually working. Slowly reduce the supply voltage. and it drops out at 3.3 volts, so it's probably just got a switching regulator, and as it's near dropout it takes up to about an amp. And I suppose one advantage of them supplying the USB cable is that you're going to get a decent quality one, because if this is pulling an amp, then one that a lot of USB cable these days have substandard conductors, so this feels sort of fairly sort of solid, chunky. I've not actually measured it, but I'd imagine they supply this cable, so they know that you can get decently low resistance, so you're not losing too much on the cable. So the case is very simple. It's just a single aluminium extrusion, just a screw in each side with a plastic cap, so it feels, it's got quite a nice feel to it. It's nice and compact. It's a lot smaller than a lot of the other PC scopes, so it's just the case and the board and very little wasted space. What you're probably going to want to do, it would have been nice if they'd have supplied it in just some sort of like a fairly sort of thin sort of carrying bag that just gives you enough space to put the probe and the USB lead, and maybe have a little zip compartment to put all the little bits and pieces of the probe and all the various other bits that come with probes. It's always nice just to be able to keep all that together, but have also a little compartment for all the little bits that will otherwise get lost. I'm sure you can probably find some sort of case that will fit that, but it would have been nice to actually supply that. In fact, the case that the probes come in, you could possibly almost get away with using that. It's about the right size, so if all else fails you can actually flip this in, and I think you'd probably get at least 2 probes in there in the USB lead before it got too ridiculous, so worst comes to worst, we could just use that. So this is the PCB in the traditional Owon blue solder resist. I've just unsoldered this. Shield is tack soldered on a few places, just unsoldered that, and there's also some copper foil between the two shields. I think that's probably mostly to have made contact with the outer metal case when it's slid in. Yeah, fairly straightforward layout. We've also got the input amplifier for each channel. We've got FPGA there. There's a Samsung 400 MHz ARM9 processor there. We've got some DDR2 RAM for the acquisition, RAM for the main processor, flash ROM, A to D, which is the HM-CAD1511 from Hittite, which is pretty standard. Note that they're multiplexing all 4 channels into one A to D, so your sample rate does go down with each additional chart. Yeah, I'm sure they'll have done it so it's like 1 GHz for a single channel, 500 or 250 depending on the number of channels. Sort of desktop 4 channel scopes tend to use 2, so like there's a 2 channel version with 1 A to D and a 4 channel version with 2, but they've multiplexed it all into a single A to D there, so just bear that in mind if you're using all the channels, that your sample rate is going to be only a quarter. Apart from that, it's all sort of pretty straightforward. There's a couple of HC595s down there just to do some digital I/O for the front end. Interesting, there's some capacitors on the outputs there, but again, presumably just filtering noise out. Those will just go off down here. There's an unused area. This is for the LAN option, so Ethernet, magnetics, and Ethernet socket there. There's an unpopulated RS232 transceiver with some sort of connector on there for it. There's an unpopulated chip there. I've no idea what that is. I wonder if maybe there's perhaps an option for like an ARB generator or something coming out of this socket that they populate for that. And really not a great deal else. There's all the power supply stuff here, sort of switching regulators, inductors everywhere. So it's pretty much what you expect to find in a scope, but minus the display and the user interface stuff. It looks fairly clean from the point of view. You can't see any bodge wires, but there are actually 1 or 2 little mods on here. There's a few sort of components, Christmas tree on top of the other. There's a sort of capacitor down there. And there is the odd 1 or 2 sort of components piggybacked on top of others here or there, but nothing too drastic. Not much on the other side, nothing at all under the shield. Just a couple of chips down there. A couple of capacitors. Interesting, although they haven't fitted the Ethernet components, they have fitted the capacitors across the isolation barrier there. Probably just so they didn't have to worry about having different configurations for the bottom side population. They've kept it all the same. Look at the front end. So we've got the BNC socket, a relay, there's a solid state relay, and a capacitor, so that's probably going to be for the AC/DC switching. It's quite a common way of doing it. Quite a lot of discretes, and there's a LMH6451 differential amp producing the differential output to drive the ADC. There doesn't seem to be any attempt to sort of equalise all the trace lengths or anything there on a scope with this bandwidth. I don't think that's really necessary. Clock synthesizer there to generate the clock for the A to D. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It's pretty much what you expect, no real surprises. Right, now being sort of Chinese supplier, I wasn't really expecting a great deal from the software because yeah, that's where a lot of Chinese products disappoint, but I've actually been sort of reasonably pleasantly surprised, certainly in terms of, yeah, pretty much everything there that is in there does appear to work reasonably well. I did have it crash once. I'm not quite sure exactly what that was down to, but it was involving sort of fairly large, downloading a fairly sort of large chunk of memory, but most of this, I'm not going to go into like a detailed review of everything here. In terms of the features, it's got pretty much all the features you'd expect. You know, this sort of scope, and you know, the features that are there do seem to work reasonably well. There are a few issues with the user interface that I think could be improved, but generally it is fairly usable. In terms of sort of screen size, this laptop's got a slightly unusual resolution. Yeah, it seems to adapt reasonably well. If you want to really minimise it, you do start losing some of the channel indicators, but you can actually live without those technically. But you can actually, for example, if you've got something here you're debugging, you need the scope screen as well. It does seem to be reasonably flexible, but I'll maximise it. One difference between this and most other USB scopes, the traditional USB scope, basically it's just the front end and the A to D converter that chucks everything into the PC, and then the PC just does everything else. This, and in some cases it also does triggering based on the sample memory, which is pretty awful a lot of the time. As you've seen for the internals, yeah, this is basically a complete scope in a box, and they're just really using the laptop as a remote display and user interface, which means that all the triggering and capturing stuff works pretty much like a decent, a scope. But one thing in particular it means is that if you're capturing with a large memory depth, you know, you're not constrained by how fast it can get the stuff into the PC, because that's all handled in the box. You know, there's only so much resolution you're ever going to see. So what it's basically doing is it's transferring data at like the screen resolution in real time. So for example, if I change this to full memory depth, 5 megasample memory depth, yeah, it's a little bit slower, but not, you know, it's certainly not transferring that whole memory into the PC. It's still sort of reasonably acceptable, and if you go to sort of intermediate depths, like say 100k, it's still perfectly responsive. So you can see the response time is pretty good, and again pretty comparable to a low to mid-range standalone scope in this sort of class. One thing you do notice, say if you do want to say stop and then start zooming in, that's where you do get a quick delay while it downloads the data. So I'll do a capture at the full memory depth. If I now want to say zoom into that, it does take a little bit of time to actually extract that. And I've actually got all 4 channels on, so this is basically downloading data for all 4 channels as well. So that is a little bit sluggish, but once it's in there you can then sort of zoom in and pan around it, so it's, you know, it's a one-time thing. And if you want to just actually work on a live zoomed in waveform, it's still reasonably responsive. For example, if I turn those other channels off, that'll probably speed it up as well. But if I sort of turn that back to live, yeah, I can be zoomed in on that full capture depth, and it still gives a pretty acceptable response time. Now, as regards user interface, there's a few, some of the obvious things do what you'd expect of them, but there's quite a few things I think they could improve. So, for example, Y shift, you just grab this and move it up and down. It is a little bit sluggish. I suspect what's actually happening here is it's actually sending that value back, away to the scope, and then it's putting it back. So there is a bit of a turnaround delay, and there are some operations that are actually quite sluggish, which I think are maybe due to the fact that you've basically got a complete scope in a box and it's just sending that in. So there's probably scope for improving that a little bit. There are keyboard shortcuts for the really important stuff, like so you've got the left hand side of the keyboard. These are your 4 Y sensitivity controls, so as you move those up and down, that works for each channel, each of the 4 channels. So you've effectively got a separate key for each channel, which is what you want. And similarly, left and right arrows operate the time base. Now, the Y sensitivity works the correct way, i.e. going up makes it more sensitive, which is the normal convention. The left-right arrows unfortunately go the wrong way. The right arrow you would expect to actually zoom in and make it faster, but it actually goes the opposite way around. It goes slower. So that's just a minor annoyance. And again, horizontal positioning you've got here. There's also, I think F5 is run stop, but there's not many other function keys. I think there would be scope for adding quite a few more keyboard shortcuts for the sort of things you use more often, but it's yeah, it's a decent start. It would be nice to see some improvements in future. And this is your trigger level over here, so again you can just set that in real time, and that works sort of quite nicely. As with a lot of our own scopes, it does start suffering from aliasing, so if I just crank that, slow the time base down. This is a 100 kHz sine wave we're feeding in here, by the way. So that's at the full memory depth, so we're still seeing a fair amount of waveform with no aliasing. If I turn the sample rate down to 1K, so the sample depth down to 1K, it will start aliasing fairly quickly and show garbage. But it does have, even if you're at the limits of memory and you're still getting aliasing, it does have peak detect sample mode. So if I put it into peak detect mode, it will now show that there's at least something in there. So although it doesn't show the detail, it just does tell you, yes, it is aliasing here because it's doing the peak measurement. So you never get that situation where you just get a completely false waveform, but you do need to remember to turn the peak on. It is sensible in the sense that when you close the program, when it comes back again, all the settings are as it was before, which again is what you'd expect from a normal scope. So that works fairly sensibly. One minor little thing I found on the triggering, I think there might be some fixed hysteresis going on here, because if we look at this waveform, it will quite happily trigger when we're in about the top half, when we set the trigger level to the top half, but as we go lower it won't actually trigger. This is an auto mode, so it only seems to want to trigger on the top half. If we increase the sensitivity a bit, the amount in the bottom that's not triggering seems to be fairly fixed. So it's that little sort of about a third of a division, so I suspect there may be some fixed hysteresis. So once you know about it, it's not a big deal, it's just a minor annoyance. It puzzled me for a while as to why I couldn't get the thing to trigger, but it's because I had the combination of a fairly low input sensitivity, and I was expecting it to trigger near the middle. It's got reasonable range of trigger modes. You've got edge, video, slope and pulse, but that all seems to work. Now, one of the things that I find particularly annoying about this user interface, a lot of the more complex things, you sort of go into this little pop-up menu and you've got all the various functions in here. Again, it's pretty much all the sort of stuff you'd find in a normal scope, but some of the selections are a little bit annoying. For example, we've got two modes. We've got single mode, alternate mode. And here, we actually have to pull down this menu to get these options. Now, when you've got 4 or 5, that makes sense, but there are some menus where there's like only 2 options in here, which have been done better with just having 2 separate buttons. But probably the most annoying thing of all is certainly some of these entry fields, particularly things like the pulse width or the hold off time. You can't just go in there and type a figure in. You have to use the up and down things. It's got auto repeat. The only thing you can do to change the step size is to click there to go into, so that's basically going the left hand digit at a time, and then you sort of go down there to do the sort of the middle digit, and then this one to the last digit, which is just horrible. I hate that. I happen to know that this starts with a pulse width which is a little bit over 90 microseconds, so I'd like to just be able to type 90 in there, whereas at the moment to get 90 microseconds I've got to sort of go down until we're into the microseconds range. There we go. But it's unnecessary fiddly. They could have improved that, but at least it does have a reset button there. The other thing that I find a little bit annoying is the trigger level. It maintains different separate trigger level values for the different trigger modes. So for example, if you can now go into edge trigger mode, it's actually got a different voltage level because each trigger mode has got its own threshold, which I can't think of any situation where you'd actually want that. Generally you'd want to change trigger modes on the same trigger level. The other thing is the actual, although we can do it on screen, if we do it here it's actually quite horrible and sort of slow, and you can see it's quite sluggish. You do get the line on the screen, but it's a bit laggy, but generally there's no, unless you know you want a specific value there, you can just do it here. It's generally quicker and easier just to do it by just dragging it. And one nice thing on alternate trigger, you've actually got all the modes for each version, so we can say alternately trigger say by an edge, and on channel 2 trigger by, let's say, a pulse width. I think also because because we've changed between single and alternate, again it's also got its own set of trigger settings for this, so that if we change trigger modes, again our trigger levels and so on aren't set up properly. We need to basically duplicate that, so that's a little bit of an annoyance. So pretty much everything you can get through this menu, and there's shortcuts to certain other things that you use more often. We've got, say, for each of the 4 channels. We've got some basic things. Obviously, you've got the indicator as to what the settings are, what the offset is. It's also got an input frequency indicator that just shows you what's coming, which is sort of quite useful because it shows that on all the channels. And you've got like the channel on-off control there. And down in this corner, we've got our sort of current trigger mode. We can pop up the trigger menu. We can force a trigger, so if we're in a mode where we're waiting for a trigger, we can just the time base, the delay, the memory depth, and the sample rate. And the sample rate just comes from all the other parameters. Up here again we've got some basic controls. We've got run stop, single trigger mode, but we've also got auto set here. If I hit the auto set button, that takes a few seconds to figure out what's going on, and then auto sets, but unfortunately it doesn't have an undo auto set. The other thing that I sort of haven't quite got the hang of, and I don't think it's implemented particularly well unless I'm really missing something, is the way it deals with sort of deep memory, in that you've got this sort of bar along the top that shows you sort of the whole memory in the section you're in, but the actual sort of navigating around that doesn't seem particularly good. So we've got a slightly inconsistent appearance. We've got main, then assist set, which I think is, this sets the time window, so this is like the sort of magnified version, and then the actual zoom that zooms in, but there's no way of getting a simultaneous display, which is very disappointing. And normally what you want to see is you want to see the overview of the whole waveform, you know, a couple of cursors to show you which bit you're looking at, but you actually then want to see the zoomed in section simultaneously, but it's a bit annoying, you have to sort of change that. But I think in practice, you know, you can actually just use the normal time-based delays to achieve a lot of that in practice. It just seems not particularly sensible. And one thing I think which is ridiculous is that when you set the time base over 100 milliseconds, it forces you into this roll mode, but also it forces you into auto trigger mode. Yeah, it actually tells you, when time per divider longer than 100 milliseconds, trigger will be set to auto mode. But you know, if you're wanting to capture infrequent events, yeah, that would actually be pretty disastrous. So that's something that definitely needs looking at. And again, I mean, the fact you've got, you know, just for setting your 3 basic trigger modes, which are like auto, normal, and single, you've got this stupid pull down rather than just sort of 3 buttons on. That's something which is sufficiently sort of fundamental. I'd actually like to see dedicated buttons to set that. Just quickly running through what else we've got in here. So we've got all the channel selections. Some of these are available as the sort of the quick buttons on the bottom. We've got some additional functions. We've got sort of invert, 20mm bandwidth limit, AC/DC coupling and ground, and the probe scaling, which is again pretty much what you'd expect. Measurements, you've got pretty much, you know, all the measurements that you'd want. Though you can actually make it display everything, which is not, but you can make it display specific measurements, so you don't end up with a screen. You just tell it which measurements you want on which channels. Doesn't seem to have measurement statistics as far as I can tell, but it's got all the sort of stuff that you'd generally want. And you can list them, you can tell it which channel, so it will show the various sort of figures for what you want, so at least it's not too cluttered. If you don't quite understand what this seems to be like a non-dynamic display that just pops up and shows everything, so don't really understand why they bother with that. And here we've just got, again, sampling mode. You know, we've got a whole menu just for setting 3 sampling mode options, which is pretty normal 3 modes. You've got sort of standard, peak, detect and averaging. Markers, again, work pretty much. These are just work on, you just drag them around and you show the figures are a little bit dark, but yeah, so that's again pretty much bog standard manual markers. Display, dots versus vectors, again, that's all pretty standard. You've got variable persistence, which seems to work reasonably well, grid control. There's also an XY mode. It's got this mode where it splits the screen into three sections, which just seems a little bit bizarre. You've got the main waveforms here. This is XY, and up here is the FFT mode. So for some reason they've done this, you know, so you can only display these modes in these dedicated sections, which just seems a bit peculiar. And in fact, there's actually a button down here which actually splits the screen, but unless you've got those modes, I really don't understand what's going on there. So you've got the usual math functions and the FFT. I'll stick a sine wave in a minute and do the FFT stuff. That actually works surprisingly well. Pass-fail mode, we can set up some effectively masks, so we can enable that, and we can set up sort of pass-fail masks and generate statistics, and you can make it stop on fail. What else we've got here? Okay, we've got record playback, and again that just records a section. You know, effectively it records pretty much what you see on screen. You can't like playback and then stop and zoom in on individual waveforms. It's pretty much a screen recorder, so you need to set the screen up right to do what you want, but that's probably quite useful, and you can play it back at different time scales, so you can actually record a burst of data and then step it through slowly. And the FFT mode actually is surprisingly quick, because obviously it's doing the processing in the box and not on the PC. So if we give it a 1 megahertz sine wave, you can see the frequency peak there. We can set the various different sender frequencies. We can drag the sensor around, but say we get this waveform and FFT display in a completely unused section over here. Yeah, so a lot of things when you do it, it says click yes to leave FFT before you even go into certain menus. Yeah, so in XY mode we've got this sort of dedicated display area, which just seems a bit odd. I just don't understand what that's about. We've got this, yeah, we can flip between that and the full mode, but we can't get either the XY or the FFT to display full screen without the main waveform. Right, so in conclusion, I actually think they've done a pretty decent job of this. I think, the price is not unreasonable. It's a similar sort of price to a conventional scope with the same capabilities, which, okay, there's a lot less in it, but it's a much lower volume product. USB scopes will never ever be a substitute for a proper standalone scope. Where you need something which is small and light, the concept of like complete scope in a box and a remote display rather than just A to D in a box and let the PC handle everything is a far better approach. It means it behaves much more like a proper scope. So it doesn't replace a desktop. It also doesn't necessarily replace sort of the handheld scope, because it depends really. Obviously every job is different. For a situation where you need to travel light but have a scope with you, I think this is a really good solution. Yeah, if you're debugging something which is maybe also connected to the laptop, you might perhaps want to have a second monitor or whatever. One thing that I would really love to see is if they actually did some software that could run on a tablet, because you may well have a laptop and say a small tablet or even a phone with you. The ability to run it on a tablet I think would be really good. A quick look through the software, I don't know a huge amount of these things, but I think it looks like it's Java, so maybe that's something that they were thinking of. But having the scope just running on the tablet I think would be really nice. Where it isn't really very good for is if you're having to like go around, for example, a big installation probing things and fault finding. That's where this, you just can't beat a proper handheld scope for that sort of thing. But if you're just traveling and the issue is just bulk and weight of actually carting the stuff around and then working on the desk, with this you're lugging around a spare display, a spare battery, and maybe a charger as well. So this is actually quite bulky, particularly obviously if you want to get everything into hand luggage as well. This is clearly a lot smaller, a lot lighter, and obviously because this is 4 channels, so it's more capable as well, and you've got a bigger screen because you're using a laptop. I don't think there's really anything particularly wrong with it. The software is quite a lot better than I expected. It does seem to do everything that it purports to do. There are some things that I would really like to see on the software. I'd like to see more keyboard shortcuts. I'd like to maybe see some of the more important functions, like perhaps trigger mode, fling mode, appear as buttons on here, so you could at least click those and see what the current settings is, maybe even sample depth, perhaps expand this menu a little bit. And so I'd certainly like to see a few more keyboard shortcuts for the things you use often. Also the expansion of zoom displays I think could be improved. But I think all in all, I think it's a pretty nice effort. I've not really looked at many other USB scopes because all the ones that are just nasty in the box, I realise they're just going to be pretty hopeless. But I think as a scope, a lightweight alternative for a scope, I actually think they've done a pretty decent job of this, and I'd give it probably probably 8 out of 10, and I think that could easily be 9 out of 10 if they just spent a little bit more time really polishing the software and maybe did a tablet version. I think possibly the one respect in which it isn't comparable to modern low-end scopes is that it doesn't have any form of intensity grading. In some modes the update rate does get up to about a couple of hundred waveforms a second, but it's certainly not doing proper intensity graded display, which is becoming standard in low-end scopes. Obviously that's something which would probably need some improved hardware, and something which obviously you would like to see, but given that limitation, something in this price range with intensity grading as well would be absolutely super. So maybe perhaps a new generation of that would be good to see. I'm not quite sure where Owon are in terms of their competitors on that side of things, but I'm sure as and when that's on their mainstream scopes, they may well look at migrating that to the USB side of things, because this is basically, once you develop the full scope, turning it into a USB box is basically a case of taking the display and the user interface out. So hopefully we might see that, but I'm not really aware of any USB scopes that do that at the moment.